Ecclesiastes, Derek Mann's very personal poem about the decisions that he had to make in his life, and his relationship with the culture he comes from. Derek Mann is an Ulster Protestant, and in this poem he meditates on what it was like to grow up in that culture, that Presbyterian, very strict Protestant culture in Ulster in the 1950s and the 1960s. And he paints a picture of a society, but more than that, he expresses the reasons why he had to leave that place in order to be true to himself. It's not an easy poem, but it's a poem that's worth reading, and hopefully I'm going to drill down into the one part of the poem that you'll remember. I think it's unusual, this poem, for Mahon, because it's quite personal. When we read Mahon's poems, he's usually writing about other people. You know, Bruce Ismay, Lawrence Oates, the fanatic, Swar Labui, the proprietor of the Chinese restaurant. Here he's writing about himself. And he's taken that, very recognizable narrative approach, and he's bringing a place to life. Let's have a look at the first stanza. It's called Ecclesiastes, by the way, because Ecclesiastes is a book of the Old Testament. And it's a book of the Old Testament that is that he would have been exposed to a lot as a child. The messages in Ecclesiastes would be very important part of the faith of the community into which he was born and which he grew up in. Okay, so I love the opening line. I won't highlight everything, promise, but I love the opening line. God, you could grow to love it. God-fearing, God-chosen, purest little Puritan that for all your wiles and smiles you are. First of all, the repetition of God, 1, 2, 3 times, that triad, is interesting. Because, of course, it's blasphemy. You're not supposed to, use God's name in the way he uses God's name here, as an exclamation. God, you could grow to love it. So the poem begins with the repetition of that word God. I think for a number of reasons. It's a poem about faith. It's a poem about religion and about the all-consuming presence of religion in his early life. And so the repetition emphasizes that importance. But also it's a poem about the disconnect between what was expected of him and what he is. And I think that's why he uses God in that way, which kind of breaks the rules that he's expected to obey in the opening line, and probably overcomplicating things. Essentially what he's saying is, to himself, when he says you, he's not talking to anybody but himself. He's certainly not talking to you or me. He's saying, look, this is who you are. You're a purest little Puritan. Puritan is another term for a Presbyterian Protestant. That's who you are. If you went back and embraced that culture, don't forget, Mahon left Northern Ireland as a young man, moved to the south actually. He lived in Cork for most of his life, in Kinsale, for much of his life in Kinsale. But he's saying, you could go back and you could embrace that culture. You could. He's thinking about the lure of home, the lure of the familiar, of going back to where he was born, going back to where he sprang from. But for me, the really, really, really interesting thing about this poem isn't that opening. It's this, there's two things, and the first part is this part. This description of what life was like in, the culture that he grew up in. He describes the dank churches, so damp and smelly, the empty streets, and then for me, the shipyard silence, the tied up swings. Now there's two really good symbols. The tied up swings in particular are a brilliant metaphor. He's referring to the fact that on the Sabbath, on a Sunday, in the world in which he lived, everything stopped. There was no work, there was no play, there was no business, there was no commerce. It was the Lord's day. The Sabbath was the day of prayer. So the shipyard he's referring to, of course, is the Harland and Wolff shipyard, which was the major employer for people from his community where the Titanic was famously built. But it's that image of the tied up swings that always gets me. What's a swing? It's a something for a child to play on. It's a source of fun, enjoyment, freedom, happiness, escape. To tie up the swing is to limit the child's ability to embrace life, to have fun. It's a symbol of the kind of restrictions to freedom that this culture places on its inhabitants, that this culture places on the people who live by its rules. And that symbol is so important in the in the poem, because it helps explain why Mahon felt himself pushed away, why he couldn't fit in this place. It's also a brilliant example of setting description. And then he says, you could go back there. And if you go back there, you could shelter your cold heart from the heat of the world, from woman inquisition, from the bright eyes of children. Yes, you could wear black, drink water, nourish a fierce zeal with locusts and wild honey. And then, this is just an incredibly important line in the poem, and not feel called upon to understand and forgive. Now, the imagery there of the locusts and the wild honey and drinking water and wearing black, that's all references to that book of Ecclesiastes and of the rules of the Puritan society, of the Presbyterian society. He said you could go back and you could just embrace it. But if you embrace it, if you decide to go back and immerse yourself in that culture, if you decide to go back and follow the rules, you'll have to give up certain things. You'll have to shelter your heart from the heat of the world. You have to accept that to embrace this attitude, this way of life, this religious, this zealous religious approach to life, you have to cut yourself off from the rest of the world. This is an insular way of living. Now, I don't want to get too complicated, but this is the idea that the belief that there is an elect, that there are people that God has chosen to go to heaven, and everybody else, they're all, damned. So you shouldn't mix with them. And Mahon is saying, if I was to go back and embrace that culture, I would have to reject the rest of the world. I would have to resist the call to understand and forgive. And if you think about what he wrote about Bruce Ismay in After the Titanic, if you think about what he wrote about The Fanatic and As It Should Be, about Lawrence Oates in Antarctica, Mahon's poetry has a real connection between his desire to understand other human beings, to look at the world through the perspective of other people. He has a deep-seated sense of empathy with other people. And in order to go back and be part of his community, he would have to suppress that instinct. And of course, what he's saying is, that's why I didn't fit in. He loves the idea, God, you could grow to love it. The idea of the certainty of religious faith. That's a very attractive idea. But he would have to suppress who he is in order to fit in with the requirements of that society. And that's why he can't. That's why he can't return. It's why he must separate himself from this culture, from his home, despite the clear pull it has over him. He says, if I did embrace this culture, I would be required to speak with a bleak afflatus. In other words, to reject the positive, optimistic view of life that it characterizes him, and love the January rains when they darken the dark doors and sink hard into the Antrim hills, the bog meadows, the heaped graves of your fathers. Again, I'm not going to mark that, but very, very, very descriptive language. The repetition of dark, capturing something of the landscape of Ulster and using that to reflect the mood of the place. Very intelligent. But then, I said there are important moments in the poem. And I think with all of these poems, just try and don't feel you have to understand every line or every nuance. Try and drill it down into 3 key moments. If you do that in every poem, you'll be really in good order. In this poem, as I've already said, the shipyard silence and particularly the tied up swings, that's number 1. The symbolism of that, massively important. Number 2, not feel called upon to understand and forgive, is that reference to his instinctive compassion, his instinctive desire to understand the world through, as experienced by other people. And the third image, which ties into that, is this image. Bury that red bandana and stick that banjo. In fact, do you know what I'm going to do? I'm only going to mark that bit. Because sometimes I can overcomplicate things. Bury that red bandana and stick that banjo. This is your country. Close one eye and be king. In the kingdom of the blind, the one-eyed man is king. That's what he's referring to. That's the biblical reference he's making. But it's the red bandana and the banjo and the stick. But the red bandana, that flash of colour that is juxtaposed with the darkness of the world that he describes. That red bandana is symbolic of the artist. He's an artist. What is art if it's not the free expression of opinion and experience? He is saying, what is a banjo? It's a musical instrument. What is music if it's not free expression of identity? The stick representative of the willingness to wander the world and to experience, like a walking stick, and to experience all of the majesty and variety and crazy contradictions of humanity. He says, if I was to go back to this place, if I was to obey this pull to go home and embrace, because I'd love to, God, I'd love to have that certainty, I would have to bury my identity. Now, suddenly, a poem which is, for Mahon, unusually deeply personal. It is a deeply personal poem. Suddenly, it takes on a universal resonance. And it's about identity. And it's about how we are who we are. And often that doesn't comply with what we're expected to be. And in order to be accepted, in order to conform to the requirements of our peers, of our society, of our families, we can be required to bury something that's intrinsic to who we are. And suddenly the poem just goes, you know, suddenly it's so broad, the meaning of this poem. The particular is him and the culture he comes from. But the broader idea of who we are and what we give up to fit in, that's something which is relatable on a universal level. The poem ends, your people await you. Their heavy washing flaps for you in the housing estates are credulous people. God, and again there's a lovely circular structure to the end of the poem. God, you could do it. God help you. Stand on a corner stiff with rhetoric, promising nothing under the sun. And that is, I think, and I don't want to get myself in trouble saying this, a pretty devastating critique of his view of the message of that attitude, that, you know, it doesn't promise anything in this life. Under the sun refers to this life. The message being in Ecclesiastes, we suffer in this life so that in the next life we will be rewarded and granted ascension into heaven. And he says that would be that certainty, that belief that I'm right and everybody else is wrong, that I'm going to go to heaven as long as I sacrifice myself in this life. That's attractive. But of course, he can't do it. He can't bury the red bandana. He can't tie up the swings. He is a free thinker. He can't separate himself from his instinct to understand and forgive. And that means that he can't be part of the society which bred him. Hope I didn't overcomplicate that. It's a really good poem. We'll talk about it in the live classes.